It was a sweltering summer afternoon when everything started to unravel in our quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of day where the heat shimmered off the asphalt and even the breeze refused to blow. And I remember it so clearly because my daughter Lily, who had just turned 10, had insisted on wearing her favorite yellow sundress, the one with tiny sunflowers stitched along the hem. And she had this determined look on her face as she grasped the handles of her little pink walker and hobbled toward the community bake sale we were hosting at the local clubhouse, her eyes sparkling with excitement and her lips set in that focused little pout she always had when she was determined to prove to the world that her disability didn't define her. And as her mother, I watched her with a mixture of pride and anxiety because I knew how cruel the world could be, how one careless word or cruel glance could unravel her fragile confidence. And I wished I could wrap her in a cocoon and shield her from it all, but I also knew that I had to let her try, let her show the world what she was made of. And so I let her go, trailing behind her with the tray of cookies she had insisted on baking herself, despite her limited mobility and the pain that sometimes clenched her legs like iron shackles. And when we reached the clubhouse lawn, the place was already bustling with neighbors setting up folding tables, stringing up cheap plastic streamers, and chatting about their upcoming vacations or gossiping about the new couple who had moved in two houses down. And I spotted Mrs. Ellington, our kind-hearted elderly neighbor, waving us over to a table she had reserved for us near the lemonade stand. And Lily's face lit up as she slowly set up her cookie display, arranging each plastic-wrapped bundle with painstaking care, humming softly under her breath. And for a moment, it felt like everything would be okay, like maybe today would be one of those rare days when nothing went wrong, but I should have known better, because lurking near the HOA booth, frowning at a clipboard and barking orders at a group of nervous volunteers, was Karen, real name Mrs. Crawford, our neighborhood dictator disguised as a suburban mother, a woman who believed that order and silence were more important than compassion and inclusion. And the moment she noticed Lily at the table, I saw her lips tighten and her eyes narrow. And I braced myself, hoping against hope that she would just keep walking, that she'd be too busy nitpicking the balloon arrangement or criticizing the font on the donation signs to bother us. But of course that wasn't the case because Karen was like a heat-seeking missile for any perceived imperfection, and in her eyes, Lily's presence, her walker, her slowness, her slightly uneven speech was an affront to the perfectly curated image Karen wanted the neighborhood to project. And so it didn't take long before she stomped over, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete, her sunglasses perched like a crown of judgment on her nose, and she stood before Lily's table with arms crossed, surveying the cookies like they were biohazards, and with a sneer she asked who approved this table in a tone that made it sound like Lily had just dumped garbage on the sidewalk, and I stepped forward immediately, trying to keep my voice calm, explaining that the table had been approved by the bake sale committee and that Lily had worked hard on her cookies, and Karen just scoffed, muttering something about food safety regulations and the optics of allowing certain people to sell things, and I could feel my blood beginning to boil, but Lily just looked up at her with those big, trusting eyes and said, "Would you like to try one? They're chocolate chip." And I swear for a split second I thought Karen might soften, might just take the cookie and walk away, but instead, she did something so vile, so utterly despicable, that I still have trouble believing it happened. She reached down, grabbed one of the wrapped cookies, unwrapped it dramatically, took a tiny bite, then spat it on the grass like it was poison, and she said, "These are inedible, and I don't think you made them yourself." And Lily's face crumpled like someone had stomped on her heart, and I was about to unleash a storm of fury when she went one step further. Karen turned to the small gathering of neighbors who had paused to watch and said loudly, "In fact, I saw this girl hovering around the Ellingtons' dessert table earlier. Wouldn't be surprised if she stole those cookies and repackaged them." And the gasp that went through the crowd hit me like a slap, because in that moment, every single person was staring not at Karen, not at me, but at Lily, my disabled daughter, my sweet, hardworking, painfully honest little girl, and she just stood there, frozen, her hands trembling on the walker, her eyes brimming with tears she was too proud to let fall. And for a few horrible seconds, nobody said anything, just awkward. shifting, a few whispers, and one man actually stepped back like Lily was contagious, and I could feel something inside me snap like a dam bursting, and I marched over to Karen, my voice shaking with fury as I told her in no uncertain terms that she had crossed a line, that accusing a child, my child, of theft in front of an entire neighborhood without a shred of evidence was not just cruel, it was slanderous. And Karen just smiled that smug, practiced smirk and said, well, if she didn't steal them, she shouldn't have a problem with me checking the security footage. And that's when Mrs. Ellington finally stepped forward, bless her heart, and said firmly, I was there the entire time. Lily didn't take anything from my table. In fact, I helped her carry her tray from her mother's kitchen, and I felt this wave of gratitude crash over me, but the damage was already done because the seed of suspicion had been planted, and no matter what we said, people were already murmuring, already filing away the image of Lily as the girl who might have stolen something, and Karen, having delivered her blow, strutted away like a victorious queen, leaving behind a 10-year-old girl who had just had her dignity shredded in front of dozens of people. And that night, as I tucked Lily into bed and brushed her hair from her forehead, she asked me in the smallest voice, Mommy, why do people think I'm bad just because I'm different? And I didn't have an answer. Because how do you explain hatred to a child who only knows love? How do you make sense of cruelty that isn't rooted in logic, only in fear and prejudice? And I held her tightly, promising that we would make things right, that we wouldn't let Karen get away with this, but deep down, I knew that restoring Lily's trust in the world wouldn't be so simple, and as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind churned with questions and rage and a burning need for justice, because Karen had done more than just humiliate Lily. She had painted her as a thief, a liar, and that stain wouldn't easily wash away, not unless I did something drastic, something bold. And as the hours crept by and the silence of the house wrapped around me like a shroud, a plan began to form. One that would require courage, persistence, and the help of every decent neighbor willing to stand against Karen's tyranny, because if she thought this was over, she didn't know who she was dealing with. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray sky overhead, the kind that pressed down on you with a quiet, suffocating weight, and I woke up with the same fire in my chest that had burned for me all night, my fists clenched and my thoughts spiraling in every direction as I tiptoed past Lily's room, pausing at her door to listen to her slow, rhythmic breathing, each breath a soft reminder of how fragile and precious she was and how much she had already endured. And as I walked into the kitchen, the sunlight breaking faintly through the clouds, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let what Karen did go unanswered, not just for Lily, but for every person in this neighborhood who had ever been silenced, shamed, or shunned by that woman and her perfect plastic smile. And as I stirred my coffee absent-mindedly, I began to make a list, mentally at first, then scribbled onto the back of a grocery receipt, bullet points of every time Karen had crossed a line in the name of HOA. Order, the time she fined the Rodriguez family for painting their mailbox a shade too bright, the time she had the Jeffersons' wind chimes removed for being audibly intrusive, the time she reported Mr. Klein, a sweet retired veteran, for feeding stray cats because it was attracting vermin. And I realized that Karen's cruelty wasn't an isolated act. It was a pattern, a sickness, a control addiction masked as community leadership, and now she had made the mistake of coming after my daughter, which meant her reign was about to end. And as I sat at the dining table in my robe, poring through old HOA newsletters and Facebook threads, something in me began to shift from fury to focus. And I called Mrs. Ellington first, knowing that if anyone would stand with us, it was her. And sure enough, within minutes, she was at my door, wearing her gardening hat and clutching a manila folder that she had labeled Karen Crawford, Incidents and Evidence. And I stared at her stunned as she explained that she had been quietly collecting information for years, ever since Karen tried to get her banned from hosting her book club, because the subject matter might be too liberal. And I felt like I had just found the missing piece of the puzzle, and together, over steaming mugs of coffee and a growing stack of papers, we crafted a plan. Not just to clear Lily's name, but to show the entire neighborhood exactly who Karen Crawford really was. And it started with the security footage. The one Karen herself had so smugly referenced during the bake sale, because little did she know I had already sent James, my husband, over to the clubhouse early that morning to speak with Mark, the young tech savvy HOA volunteer who managed the surveillance system. And Mark, bless his kind heart, was horrified when James told him what had happened and immediately pulled the footage, which showed, in high definition, Lily slowly walking from our car to the clubhouse with her tray in hand, never once veering toward any other table, and then cut to Mrs. Ellington helping her arrange the cookies, laughing and smiling as Lily beamed up at her, and then cut again to Karen arriving later, glaring in our direction before stomping toward the table like a shark who'd caught scent of blood, and James brought the USB home, his face pale and angry as he handed it to me, and I knew right. Then we had the first nail for Karen's proverbial coffin. But I wasn't going to just post it online. I wanted to do this the right way, clean, documented, and undeniable. So I called a neighborhood meeting using the very same HOA channels Karen loved to exploit for her endless rule updates and garden regulation emails. And to my surprise, over 24 families RSVP'd within the hour, people who had seen the incident or heard about it and were disgusted, people who had stayed silent out of fear or exhaustion but were now ready to speak up, and that evening, as the community center slowly filled with folding chairs, murmurs of curiosity, and tension in the air, I watched Karen stroll in 10 minutes late, dressed like she was attending a fundraiser, smirking like this was some kind of joke, and she didn't even glance at Lily, who was sitting quietly in the front row with her sketchbook on her lap, drawing little birds and flowers like she always did when she needed to feel safe. And when the clock struck 7, I stood up and took the podium, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears, and I began with my story, not just what happened at the bake sale, but what it meant, how it felt to watch my daughter be humiliated, how it felt to see the seeds of suspicion and shame take root in her heart, and the room was silent as I spoke, every eye on me, every breath held. And then I played the footage, the USB footage that showed the truth, so clearly it was painful, and the room erupted, not with anger at me, but with stunned disbelief and scattered clapping, and I could see people turning to Karen, shaking their heads, whispering to one another, and then Mrs. Ellington took the stage, her voice shaking but firm as she read a list of other incidents involving Karen, supported by dates, photos, and even an audio recording of Karen threatening to evict a single mother for letting her toddler draw on the sidewalk with chalk. And what followed was a cascade. One by one, neighbors began standing up, sharing their own stories, like a dam had burst and all the resentment, all the fear and frustration Karen had built up over the years was pouring out, and through it all, Karen sat rigid in her chair, her face tight, her jaw clenched, her fingers drumming against her designer handbag, and when it was clear that no one was defending her, she finally stood, tried to speak, tried to say it was all being taken out of context, that she only wanted to maintain standards, that people like that, and she gestured toward Lily without even looking at her, sometimes don't understand boundaries, and that was when James stood up, his voice booming as he shouted, "That's my daughter you're pointing at," and the entire room turned on her like a wave, and someone in the back called out, "Get her off the board," and another shouted, "She needs to resign," and suddenly there was this groundswell, a momentum I hadn't expected but was deeply grateful for, as neighbors began chanting and demanding a vote, and Mark, the volunteer who had retrieved the footage, quietly stepped forward and reminded everyone that according to the HOA bylaws, if 2/3 of the members present called for a vote, a temporary suspension could be enacted pending a formal investigation, and within minutes the vote was cast 29-2, with only Karen and one of her cronies voting in her favor. And just like that, she was suspended, stripped of her authority, her power slipping through her fingers like sand, and she stood there, stunned, speechless for once, her face pale, and twisted in disbelief. And then she turned on her heel and marched out of the room without another word, and I looked down at Lily, who had stopped drawing and was now staring up at me with wide, amazed eyes, and for the first time in days, she smiled a real smile, and I knelt beside her and whispered, "See, sweetheart, the truth always comes out," and she nodded slowly, reaching for my hand, and as we walked out of that meeting hall surrounded by applause and supportive murmurs, I felt lighter than I had in years, but deep down I knew it wasn't truly over, not yet, because people like Karen don't vanish. They regroup, they retaliate, and I had no doubt that she would find some way to come after us again, whether through legal loopholes, social manipulation, or petty revenge. And sure enough, within days, Strange things began to happen. Our mailbox was smashed in the middle of the night. Lily's name was scratched into the sidewalk in chalk along with the word liar. Our garbage bins mysteriously disappeared, and anonymous complaints about excessive noise from our home began flooding the HOA inbox. And while she no longer held an official title, Karen still had influence, still had followers, and it became clear that she was waging a silent war from the shadows, hoping to wear us down, to make us leave, and every day became a new battle defending against lies, protecting Lily from seeing the worst of it, holding on to our sanity and sense of justice in the face of passive aggressive sabotage. But we refused to back down, and one morning Lily surprised me by asking if she could speak at the next neighborhood gathering, and my first instinct was to say no, to protect her from further hurt. But she looked at me with that same determined glint in her eye, the one that had driven her to bake cookies on aching legs, and she said, Mommy, I want them to see me, not what she said about me, but who I really am. And I realized then that this wasn't just my fight, it was hers too, and she was ready to reclaim her voice. And so we began preparing her speech together, every word written in her own handwriting, every line spoken aloud until she could say it without trembling. And as the next meeting approached, I watched my daughter grow stronger, more confident, her pain transforming into power. And I knew that whatever came next, whatever Karen had left in her arsenal, we would face it together, not as victims, but as a family united. And when the night of the meeting finally arrived and Lily stepped up to that podium with her walker steady beneath her hands, the room fell completely silent, every eye on her tiny figure and her brave, determined heart. And as she opened her mouth to speak, I knew that something extraordinary was about to happen, something no smear campaign, no cruel lie, no whispering gossip could ever undo. The moment Lily stepped up to the podium, clutching the sides of her walker, like it was the only thing tethering her to the earth, a hush swept across the room, deeper and more powerful than any silence I'd ever experienced, as if the walls themselves had paused to listen. And I stood off to the side, my heart thudding in my chest like a warning drum, terrified that her voice would falter, or that someone would laugh or interrupt or whisper something cruel. But then she lifted her chin, her sunflower dress hanging just a little crooked on her thin shoulders, and in a voice that trembled at first but then grew stronger with every word, she began to speak. My name is Lily Thomas, and I have something to say. And just like that, she had everyone, every HOA member, every neighbor, every former Karen sympathizer who had come expecting fireworks or drama, completely spellbound as she told her story, not just about the day Karen accused her of stealing cookies, but about what it felt like to grow up in a world where people whispered about her when they thought she wasn't listening, where they assumed she couldn't do things just because she walked differently or took longer to speak. And she described how she'd practiced for days to make those cookies, how proud she'd felt carrying them to the table, how excited she had been to be included, and how all of that had been shattered in seconds because of one woman's cruelty. And she didn't cry, not once, even when she paused and looked at the crowd with tear-glazed eyes and asked, "Why do people look at me like I don't belong?" And I saw more than a few adults wiping their eyes at that moment, grown men shifting uncomfortably, women pressing tissues to their faces. And I wanted to both cry and cheer because Lily, in that moment, wasn't just my little girl. She was the truth, raw and unfiltered, exposing every crack in the perfect suburban mask our neighborhood wore. And when she finished, when she said quietly, I don't want people to be afraid of me or feel sorry for me. I just want to be treated like everyone else. There was a beat of stunned silence before the room erupted in applause, not polite clapping, but thunderous, standing ovation applause, the kind that echoed off the walls and rattled the windows. And I rushed to her, wrapping my arms around her trembling body as people lined up to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her how brave she was. And in that moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would finally change, that the poison Karen had injected into our community might finally start to drain away. But of course, that was wishful thinking because the very next day, a new anonymous complaint was posted on the HOA bulletin board, a full-page printed letter accusing me of using my daughter's disability to manipulate public opinion and suggesting that our family thrived on victimhood. And though the letter wasn't signed, it was printed on the same high-end stationery. Karen always used for her party invitations, complete with the distinctive floral watermark in the corner. And that was only the beginning, because suddenly we were hit with a barrage of small but deliberate harassments. Our lawn was flagged for being too long. Even though we had just mowed it the day before, our trash cans were knocked over again and again, and someone even left a fake eviction notice on our front door with a crudely drawn caricature of Lily in a wheelchair, tears streaming down her face, and the cruelty of it was so calculated, so vile that I felt physically sick. But what disturbed me even more was how quiet the neighborhood had become again. Like after that one show of support, people had retreated into their houses, too afraid to get involved. And while a few kind souls like Mrs. Ellington continued to check in and speak up, the majority had gone silent, perhaps hoping that if they ignored the problem long enough, it would disappear. But I knew. Karen, I knew that silence was exactly what she wanted, because silence was her playground, her weapon of choice. And I realized that if we didn't strike back again, if we didn't keep the momentum going, she would simply slink back into her shadowy influence and continue poisoning everything. So I doubled down. I started organizing community events centered around inclusion, using my own money if I had to, inviting families with children who had disabilities from outside the neighborhood to come and share their stories, and I contacted local news stations, eventually convincing one sympathetic reporter to cover Lily's story in a weekend feature that aired on the evening news, complete with security footage, Lily's speech, and interviews with several neighbors who had experienced Karen's wrath. And while most people responded with support, the backlash from Karen's shrinking but still loyal group of followers was fierce. They accused me of exploiting my child for media attention, said I was turning the neighborhood into a circus, and one woman even cornered me outside the grocery store and hissed, "You're ruining everything." But I refused to stop, because every time Lily smiled at me with that quiet pride in her eyes, I knew I was doing the right thing. And then one afternoon, everything escalated in a way none of us expected. Lily had been invited to a classmate's birthday party, and she was over the moon with excitement, dressed up in a sparkly blue outfit with matching bows in her hair, and James had taken the day off work so we could all walk her there together, hand in hand, proud of how far she had come. But as we turned the corner near the host house, we were met with a horrible sight. The yard was filled with balloons and decorations, but a large poster had been pinned to a tree right out front, and on that poster was a doctored photo of Lily behind fake jail bars with the words, "Watch your purses," scrawled in bright red letters, and I froze, stunned, as Lily stopped in her tracks and stared at it, her smile falling away like shattered glass. And I looked around, seeing other kids and parents awkwardly turning away, pretending not to notice, whispering behind their hands, and James tore the poster down in a rage while I held Lily as she began to cry. Not the quiet kind of crying she usually did, but loud, gasping sobs that broke something inside me, and I knew we couldn't let this go unanswered. Not this time, not when it was so public, so cruel, so clearly targeted. So we filed a police report, not just about the poster, but about the ongoing harassment, providing all the documentation we'd been collecting for months. And while the officer was sympathetic, he warned us that unless we caught someone in the act, there was little they could do beyond issuing a general warning, which Karen would almost certainly ignore or deny. And it felt like running in circles, like trying to fight smoke with our bare hands. But then something unexpected happened. The story gained traction online, the local news segment was picked up by a national outlet, and suddenly our small suburban neighborhood was in the spotlight, flooded with attention, sympathy, and scrutiny, and with it came pressure, real pressure, the kind that Karen couldn't deflect with charm or silence, and the HOA board, now minus Karen but still under heat for their years of inaction, was forced to call a special vote to permanently remove her from all decision-making positions and to formally censure her for conduct unbecoming of a board member. And while she fought it, even threatening to sue the HOA for character defamation, the vote passed with overwhelming support, and for the first time in years, her power was truly stripped away, her voice no longer a threat, but an annoyance, her presence a reminder of what we'd overcome. And though she still lived in the neighborhood, skulking around with sunglasses and a scowl, her reach was gone, and in her place, something new began to take root, a sense of cautious hope, of tentative unity, as neighbors who had once avoided us began to reach out, asking how they could help, how they could learn, how they could make things better for not just Lily, but for other families like ours. And I found myself organizing workshops on empathy, accessibility, and kindness, using our garage as a makeshift community center. And Lily, to my astonishment, became something of a local hero, invited to speak at school assemblies, featured in a children's magazine, even receiving a letter from a senator thanking her for her courage. And I watched her blossom with each new opportunity, her confidence growing, her sense of self worth no longer held hostage by what one cruel woman had said. And while the scars of what she endured would never fully disappear, they were now part of a larger story, a story of resilience, of resistance, of rising above hate to forge something better. And one night, as we sat together on the porch swing, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, Lily turned to me and said, "Mommy, I'm glad it happened." And I blinked, shocked, asking her what she meant, and she smiled gently and said, "Because now people see me." And I realized she was right, that through all the pain and humiliation and heartbreak, we had uncovered something powerful, not just about our neighbors or our community, but about ourselves, about what it meant to fight for dignity and truth. And while the battle wasn't over, while prejudice still lurked in quiet corners and Karen still whispered her venom to anyone who would listen, we were no longer afraid, no longer alone, and we were ready for whatever came next. Weeks had passed since the poster incident and Karen's final fall from grace, and yet, even in her silence, a shadow of her cruelty still clung to the edges of our neighborhood like an old, bitter stain that wouldn't wash out. And while life had slowly begun to resemble something close to normal, Lily returning to her school days with more confidence than ever before, James smiling more often, and neighbors actually waving hello as they passed, there was a new undercurrent beneath it all. A. Simmering awareness, an uneasy recognition that our community had been forced to look itself in the mirror and reckon with what it had allowed to fester for so long. And it was clear to me now that Karen, for all her venom, had simply exposed a deeper rot, one made of silence, complacency, and quiet complicity. And while she had become the face of the harm, she wasn't the only one who needed to be held accountable. And that realization drove me forward into something bigger than just protecting Lily. I wanted to create lasting change, to build something stronger and more inclusive, so no other child, no other parent, no other vulnerable person would be made to feel like we had felt. And so I began drafting what I called the Lily Clause, a proposed amendment to the HOA charter that would implement specific protections against discrimination based on disability, medical condition, or perceived otherness, and would require training and regular reviews for all HOA officials on inclusive community practices. And I was fully prepared for pushback, for groans about political correctness or excessive bureaucracy. But to my surprise, the reception was warmer than I expected. Neighbors who had once looked away during our struggles were now volunteering to help edit the proposal, offering to circulate it door to door for signatures, and several even shared their own stories of quiet discrimination, like the new residents down the street who were denied permission to build a wheelchair ramp for their aging father, or the single dad whose autistic son had been accused of being aggressive just for flapping his hands while playing. And I realized that we weren't alone, not really, and that maybe what we had endured had shaken something loose in the collective heart of this place. And as the proposal made its way through the proper channels, gaining momentum and quiet support, I could feel Karen watching us from the sidelines, her expression hard and unreadable as she walked her little white dog each morning, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone who might remind her of her defeat. And while she never approached us directly again, I heard whispers that she had tried, unsuccessfully, to launch a petition against the so-called victim cult she claimed was overtaking the neighborhood. But this time, her words didn't hold sway, and her allies had either distanced themselves or publicly apologized, and it was almost sad to watch her fade, like that, stripped of the influence she once wielded like a sword. But I couldn't waste my time mourning her reputation, not when there was so much still to be done, and so I kept pushing, kept organizing, even began working with nearby communities to share what we'd learned, connecting with advocacy groups and speaking at panels about suburban inclusivity. And through it all, Lily was right there beside me, sometimes quietly drawing in the corner while I met with community leaders, other times standing proudly next to me as we handed out flyers or addressed a school board meeting about disability representation in curriculum. And her voice, once timid and halting, had grown clear and sure, and I could see how people responded to her, not with pity, but with respect, with admiration, and it lit something in her, something I hadn't seen before, a spark of purpose. And one evening, as we prepared for the final HOA vote on the Lily Clause, she told me she wanted to start her own blog, a place where kids with disabilities could share their stories and support one another, and I helped her set it up, watching as she typed her first post with a smile titled, "I Am Not Broken," and when she hit publish, I knew this was only the beginning for her, that what had started as a moment of humiliation was evolving into a mission of empowerment, and on the day of the HOA vote, the community center was filled to capacity, neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, and the atmosphere was electric, not tense, but hopeful, like we were all collectively waiting for something important to happen. And I stood beside Lily at the front, our proposal projected on the big screen, and I gave a short speech thanking everyone for their courage, for choosing kindness, for stepping out of fear and into action. And then Lily took the mic, smiling shyly but confidently, and said, "Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing me." And the room erupted in applause again. But this time it wasn't for her pain, it was for her power, her strength. And when the votes were counted, the Lily Clause passed with 95% approval, making it one of the most supported measures in our HOA's history. And in that moment, as James lifted Lily into the air and spun her around while cameras flashed and neighbors cheered, I felt something lift off my shoulders, the final weight of months of fear and fighting replaced now by something warmer. Hope, yes, but also resolve, because this wasn't the end, it was the foundation of something bigger. And over the next few months, change began to ripple outward. Our neighborhood partnered with a local disability advocacy center to host inclusive events. Several families installed ramps and sensory gardens with community funding, and a mural was painted on the clubhouse wall, a giant sunflower with the words "Kindness grows here" beneath it, signed by every child in the neighborhood, including Lily, whose bold signature took up almost half the stem. And while Karen remained in her house, peeking out from behind her curtains and grumbling at passersby, she was now simply background noise, a relic of an uglier past that we had collectively chosen to leave behind. And one day, as Lily and I sat at the edge of the park where it had all begun, watching a group of kids, including some with walkers and wheelchairs, playing tag and laughing with complete freedom, she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I used to think people like Karen were the bosses of everything, but they're not." And I smiled, brushing her hair back, and said, "No, sweetheart, they just shout the loudest." And she nodded slowly, looking up at the sky, and added, "But now we're louder." And I realized then that she was right, that through every tear, every insult, every act of cruelty, we had raised our voices, not in anger, though we had every right, but in truth, in love, in unshakable belief that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. And as the sun dipped low behind the trees and the shadows lengthened across the grass, I knew deep in my heart that no matter what the future held, Lily would be okay because she had found her voice, and now the whole world was listening.